Hi, I'm brittwriterly. This is a writerly conversation. You are right now in my book and author 2 channel. If you like what you see and you are not yet subscribed, but you like the vibe, you can hit that big red button. We could be internet friends. Yes, we can. And if you are subscribed, you like the vibe, but you keep missing me, then you should ring that bell. Ring that bell so you stop missing all my uploads and lives and premieres like so. And now I will let my lovely co-host introduce herself.
Hey everybody, I'm Shay. My channel is Shay with the Hobbies. I write short stories, poetry, and the occasional blog post. Eventually, there will be a new intro. When it is officially April, there will be a new intro. Y'all think it's April because y'all seeing this in April, but it's not April for me. So there's that. But hey, y'all, hey.
So it is National Poetry Month. And like we did last April, we're going to talk about poetry. So last April, we talked about our favorite poets. And if you have not watched that video, you should definitely click the link above and watch that. Come back when you're done. We will still be here and listen to premiere. And if you're watching the premiere, don't go anywhere. Stay with us. Watch it later. There's a playlist. But this Poetry Month, we want to talk about how we write poetry. And so we're going to talk about our process. We're going to give you a little of our favorite poems that we have written. And yeah, there may be some couplets being dropped in the live chat if we feel fancy. And if you feel fancy, you drop a couplet, you drop a haiku, you do what you do, and we will too. Okay, see, it's already starting to rhyme. You see? Okay, let's get into it. So, question number 1. How has your poetry writing process developed? So, Cash, I'll let you start because we both know if I start talking, it'll go on.
So I feel like I've said this before, but so how I got started writing was with poetry. It was the first thing that I ever wrote. And it was at the suggestion of a therapist. So for me, poetry very much started as just a way to write out my feelings and emotions. So my writing process initially with poetry is feel something, write something. Feel something, write something. Feel something, write something. And I also had a very childlike understanding of poetry. So everything had to rhyme and everything had to hit the same type of beat. I didn't know about, what's the word I want to use? Like meters and things like that in poetry. So it was literally just feel something, write something, feel something, write something. And then as I got older and into high school and into college, my love and desire and understanding for poetry grew. I was reading more, classical poetry, of course, because you're in high school and you need to graduate and whatnot. And then I was in an honors intro to lit class and I was learning about the different types of poems and like a, B, B, C, C, A, B, C, A, B, all the different types. And so then poetry became a more focused outlet. So it became more so like I would have things that I was thinking about. So not just things that I was feeling, but things that I was like experiencing or things that I had questions about. And that would become poetry. So a lot of like going from high school into college was for me, my adulthood, because, I moved out when I was 16. So from 16 to like 21, a lot of my poetry was just low-key talking to God, like literally for me. It was just things that I didn't understand, things that I was going through, and it was just that was what I wrote. So it became even more so personal than before. Like it was like these were things that I wasn't sharing with people. And then as I got older and into what I consider actual adulthood, so like 25 and up to now, it's definitely become a form of activism, a form of liberation, a lot more form of self-expression than just a form of therapy for me, because that's honestly what I would say my original poetry writing process was. It was just therapeutic, and that was it. Like, I had no real rhyme or reason. It was just, let's get this stuff out. Now I think so much more about the message of the poetry. Now it is so much more than I'm doing this for me. It's a I'm doing this for us mentality when I'm writing. There is a lot more, especially if I'm like writing for something, so like an event or like a place to present. um for me, I'm a very, very spiritual person, so like when I have to write for something that I know is going to be used for like a graduation or a conference or something that it's supposed to go out to people, there's a lot of separating that I do when I write. Then like I limit like watching like pretty much anything, like anything, like everything. I don't listen to anything but like worship music, things that I think are like going to edify my spirit and put me in the like right mindset to write something. Because I don't take speaking to people, but especially like my people, lightly. And I don't think that in those moments when I have been asked to do something that it should be about me. So I'm always like I'm fasting more, I'm praying more, like no lie. I feel like that's like my relationship with God is like at its peak where I'm doing something for other people, if I'm being totally honest, because I do take like that way more seriously. And so that would be when I feel like I have more of a like documented process of like how I do the poem. Other than that, I think the way my process has changed with my poetry has been my mindset with conceiving the idea and like writing it out. Like I'm usually a poem in one setting type person. I don't usually like carry poems out like days or weeks. Like it's not at all like when I'm writing a story or anything. Like it's a very focused, I need to get this all out. And very rarely do I edit a poem. Like very rarely, once I've written it, do I ever go back and change anything, because I don't leave it with anything that needs to be changed, if that makes sense. Like it's just how I want it and how all the pieces come together. So yeah, I feel like I talked a lot, but I hope that answered the question.
It did. You answered the first and second question, really. It's okay. It's okay. So how I started writing poetry, I didn't start writing poetry until high school. I was in English class. It was the poetry section. She gave us this fill in the blank sheet, and she was like, once you fill this in, you will have a poem. And that is the first poem that I remember writing, and it was called What If? And that was the theme of the fill in the blank poem. And so after, like, it's a super basic poem, but I still wrote that, like the poetry journal that I have now, the document that I have now, that's about that's over 100 pages. I actually, it's over 200 pages. It's a 226 page document. The document that I have now, that started in high school, and I put that poem in my poetry document. So is it a basic poem? Absolutely. It is the most simplistic and materially irrelevant poem that I have, but it is the poem that started me realizing that this was a way of expression beyond just like holding it in or ranting to myself or to a friend or to a sister or giving attitude. Like this was a way for me not to have to find passive aggressive ways to express myself. I could just say everything that I really wanted to say, and I didn't have to worry about someone calling me disrespectful or saying I had an attitude or telling me to stay in my place. Like I could just say it all unfiltered and there would be no response. And sometimes you just need that. So that's how I started writing. When I got into college, I got more into spoken word poetry. And so my poem, the construction of my poems definitely changed from poems that I just wrote and never expected to say, basically diary entries. And it changed into things that were spoken that I was just waiting on a chance to be able to say, even if it was in a class, in a response to something. My response may be like 2 lines of a poem that I actually wrote and speaking to something that happened in the novel, or something that responded to a classmate. Like these were poems that I expected or wanted to be able to say, to perform. So in college, it got more into like the performative poetry than written poetry. And you can see the change in the way that they're written and the words chosen. There's a more clear rhythm to those spoken word poems than there was in the earlier works that were just, some of them were ranty and they were very angsty, but like I said, I was in high school. So like that's the second sort of iteration of my poetry. And then the third iteration, and the iteration that I am in now, and maybe there's beginning to be a fourth one, but we'll just say we'll just keep it in the third wave, so to speak, is a poetry for self-discovery. So when I got to grad school, it was a lot of change, and there was just a lot of strong opinions and strong statements around me, plans for me and my career trajectory. Like I really just had to step fully into who I am and decide if I'm okay with that. And if I am going to be okay with that, then what is that thing that I'm prompt me to do and to say? And so the poems still sort of have that like spoken word rhythm to them. But they're way more introspective. They're not as much a commentary or a critique. They're an internal exploration of ideas and concepts, self, that sort of thing. And third wave part B, like those poems, they do come out in multiple sittings, partly because I am being so honest with myself. And I think poetry has a way of holding you accountable to saying what's true. Even though some people can use poetry to like obfuscate their point, for me, when I'm writing something in poetry, it's way easier for me to lie in a novel than it is for me to lie in a poem. Like it's just so difficult. I really can't manage it. And so sometimes it just takes me multiple days to tell myself the truth about something. And so I do have poems that it took me days or even months to finish, because I was just slowly realizing, slowly facing, slowly being honest about a particular theme. And the poem held me accountable to like following that journey all the way through. So that's sort of how my process has developed. I'll slide us into the second question, and Shay, if you have something that comes back up, then maybe you'll have something new to add. It's okay. So the second question is, how is your poetry writing process different from your prose? So like I said, it's easier for me to lie in my prose, although my poetry, I am way more comfortable making my poetry about myself, my third wave poetry. I am far more comfortable making my third wave poetry about myself, because like second wave poetry, I was in college, a lot of that did get shared. It got shared in theater performances that I created that were seen by like audiences. It got shared at like convocations for events. So like my poetry in college, second wave poetry, college poetry did get shared. So that I agree, like that is less about you and more about your people. But my third wave poetry is way more introspective. So the fundamental difference before we even get into the process between my prose and my poetry is that I'm more comfortable with my poetry being about myself. I'm less comfortable with novels being about myself. My novels are more like my second wave poetry, where it's like I'm talking about our community. I'm talking to our community, and I'm imagining Black teenagers reading my books. Like that's the difference in intent. And process, obviously it takes me longer to write a novel than it does a poem, and there's also more planning. I pant my poems every time. Like I may have an idea of what I want to say, like I do often have an idea that of what I want to say, or a concept that I want to explore. But even in my, like, even in hashtag first fantasy, which I did pants, I still knew what I wanted to do, and I had scenes in my head that I wanted said. In poetry, it's more like I'm flowing, and I may have lines that I want to put in, but those lines don't always get to stay once the poem really takes its flow. Like, it's just way more discovery in the moment, what sounds good and is true. Like, it really is just like, it unfurls really quickly, almost like when you snap a towel out, like it unfurls really quickly like that. My novels do not. I wish that they did just snap out like you're fanning out a carpet, but they don't. And the process is way more cyclical. It's really cyclical. I write, I revise, I write, I revise, I run it by CPs, we talk, I revise, I write. Like, it's way more cyclical. I don't really share poems until I'm done with them. Like, I am my CPU on my poetry, and that's sort of it. So my poetry is a more like individual creative process that is really more introspective at this stage, and my prose writing process is more communal as writing can be, and more attentive to readership than personal development.
Yeah, I completely agree. Poetry is super duper personal for me, so there is no critiquing of my poetry. Like,
right.
I mean, like, you can have your thoughts on it, but like, I feel like, and also I'm not one of those people that feels like my poetry is for interpretation. Like, I said what I said and I meant what I said. Like, you can totally get something out of it, but you totally be wrong if it's not what I meant. Like I'm that person when it comes to my poetry. I feel like people make poetry seem like it's so much deeper all the time. Like, when I hear people and they're like, I just don't understand poetry, it's so confusing to me sometimes, because it's like, I feel like people make stuff way deeper than it has to be. Like, it's a love poem, it's about love. It don't have to be about his mama leaving him when he was 3 months old and how he somehow never forgot. Like, I don't know, I'm just not that person. And so with my poetry, because it is personal, like, nobody is gonna know it better than me. Mm-hmm. Like, for my stories are very much communal stories. It is our stories I'm trying to tell. It's not all my reality, because it's not about me. We've talked about this before. I feel that, it is selfish to write a story solely for you that's not a memoir. Like, it doesn't make sense to me, not when you say your goal is to write for these other young children that are behind, right, that are coming up. And so for me, like you, like, there is no critiquing of my poetry. It is very personal. It is very honest, which again is why, like, I don't like interpretations on my poetry, because like, I'm being brutally honest in this. So for you to try to manufacture what you think is there, to me, does my poetry a disservice. Now with fiction, yeah, totally, you could totally grasp for stuff. I'm gonna tell you that's not what I was thinking, but if that's what you got, go ahead, be blessed by it. But like, it is a different thing. I also I agree with the dang, it was something that you said about about the like process. Like I said, yeah, like, it's a lot more work that goes into my fiction. And I also feel like for me, that's because y'all don't see my poetry unless I want you to. Right. Like, the fiction is meant to be read by other people. It is meant to be consumed. Poetry is for me. Like, it is for me. And if you get to see it, that's a blessing that you don't realize you're getting, because it's not meant for you. And so, which is part of the reason why I've been like toying with wanting to write a novel in verse, but like, I feel like that would be too personal. Like, I feel like if I wrote a novel in verse, or wrote a book in verse, it would be my memoir. It wouldn't be a novel. Like, I don't know if I could do that, because of how personal I see poetry and how like intimate I feel like it is to me. I don't think I could write a fictional, like, I don't think I could write a novel in verse. I think I could write my memoir in verse, but I don't think I could, for the nature of what that is. So that was just interesting thought I had, like, in the moment. Like, I don't think I could do that, because
I kind of want to.
I want to. I think the idea is really great, but I feel like, I don't know. So I very rarely have written a poem and not cried. Like very rarely have I written a poem, whether it's a great, like good poem, it's a positive poem or not, because it's so personal for me.
Yeah.
It is so emotional. And so like a novel, I don't know.
That's a lot. That is a lot to commit to. I'm not gonna hold you. It's a lot to commit to.
It is.
And that's why I'm like, I want to do it. It may be a novella, or B, it would be a multi-POV story where only one of the characters POV.
I could see that.
I could so that I had a little bit of a break. Yeah, because I feel like one or two, maybe more people have asked me like, oh, would you ever write a book of poetry? And I'm like, oh, like it's not on my to-do list.
But it would be a book of poetry for us, so it wouldn't, like, it would be easier because I have the like idea in mind already, but like it wouldn't be, I couldn't do a novel.
And I'm the opposite, because I'm like, I don't like you said, I don't need you to interpret my words. I said what I meant, like, but once you publish something, it's out there. So you can say that's not what I meant, but you can't stop the papers or the tweets or the whatever people are going to say, saying that here's what I got from it. And so for me, I'm just like,
right, like, no, and that's my thing is, you can get something from it. I'm gonna just tell you wrong if you ask me. Like, this is what you were talking about. Nah, that's not. I'm glad you got that, but that wasn't that. No, you see the words I used? That's what I was talking about. It was actually about racism. It wasn't about it wasn't about something else. No, so, I said black and I meant black. I didn't mean people of color. I meant black. Like that type of stuff. Like,
it would be easier for me to write a novel or a novella, or a POV of a novel in verse, because one, I think I want to do it because it would be such an exercise in character immersion, because I'm not going to be able to write a poem from a character if I don't understand how that character writes poetry, because it can't look like mine, which nobody would know that but me, that it looks like my own. But I wouldn't want it to. I would want to challenge myself to write X character's poetry, not write poetry about that character and call it theirs. And so I think that's why it wouldn't be personal to me. I'm like, well, it's not me, it's them. But that, like I said, that's a real challenge of whether or not you know and grasp your character to be able to write that kind of art from them. So I am looking forward to it, and I want to. I do. So it is something that I have considered doing. I have a project in mind where I could write it from a particular character's POV. So that's something I'm thinking about. But write my own book of poetry, yeah, I would sooner write a character's than my own. Do you have anything else to say about that? Okay. How does the poetry that you read affect what you write? Right? Or so, like, how does the character that you read or hear affect the poetry that you write?
Okay, so one of my like favorite childhood poems is Sick by Shel Silverstein. I still almost I cannot go to school today. It's a little Peggy and McKay. I have the measles and the mumps, the gash and purple bumps. So it was one of the first poems I ever memorized, and I like used it in speech competitions all the time. But it is what, like, going back and rereading it as an adult is what got me back into the art of telling a story with poetry. Because that's what that was. That was a story in a poem. It wasn't just, these are my feelings. It wasn't just metaphorical or anything like that. Like, it was a little story about a little girl lying to her mama so she don't have to go to school, then realizing it's Saturday and she about to go outside and have fun. Like, it's cute, but that's the poem. And so it started with that, and then it grew into like back when I used to download videos from YouTube and turn them into MP3s and make them CDs so I could listen to them on long drives. Your girl did that for like 5 seasons or however many seasons of Deaf Poetry Jam you can
Yeah.
find on YouTube. So, excuse me. So that got me back into storytelling, and it's what got me more into the like writing for us, because so many of the poems that I love the most were written for us. They weren't the like haha funny ones. They were the ones like the Knock Knock by Daniel Beatty. Like that one was like, oh, that rocks my soul every time I hear it. I cry every single time. When you know I heard Rudy Francisco's love poem medley, and I was like,
bro,
this is a love poem to me.
Yes.
This is what I've read before, what I've heard before, what I've told is beautiful and science and blah blah blah. Ain't nothing compared to that. That moved me. I felt that in my soul. I said, ooh, dang, okay, all right, yes, I want it. Like it was so many emotions. And so that feeling, those feelings, those desires that other poets in their poems give me is what I try to put into every poem I write, right? Like if I feel after I say a line or after I read a line, if I still feel that, if I still years later still I remember why I wrote that one. Like that's the ultimate for me. So that would be what I say, like what I get from like the poems that I read and I've heard and I memorized. The way they make me feel is the most important part. And having something evoke emotion is what I mean, it's what I strive in all my writing. It's to evoke emotion. And I think more so in my novels, I try to evoke action, like movement and change with what I'm writing. Like I try to make you think differently. And with poems, I want you to feel and I want you to think. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to act on anything, but just think on things differently. And for me, I feel like that's what listening and hearing and reading other things like
I totally agree. And I mean, it's good when like all you have to do is say love medley. And I was like, oh, it's like I like the word that you use, like evokes. Like the poetry that moves me the most is evocative. Like it's poetry that you can't read or listen to and be still in body or spirit, like something gotta move. And those are the poems that I play again and again and again. Like Woman to Woman by Thea Monnier, like that poem is so funny.
It's hilarious. I love it. You'll see me waving back at you. I was like, girl.
The phone call got me. Calling about my men's underwear. I bought him.
Right.
Called me about how I taught him. I screamed when I heard that for the first time. I screamed out loud, wanted to do a lap, like, but you're right. It is those poems that tell a story that I want to go back to. And so it's those sort of poems that move me as a listener. As a poet, someone who's like, oh, I want to try that. When I was in college, I really loved Strivers Row and the poets on it, like not forget their names now. Joshua Bennett, Alicia Harris, Zora Howard. I loved. I love Zora Howard's poetry. Jasmine Mans is a powerful poet. Like those poems that I hear that I'm just like, wow, like that really, whether you're talking about a middle school prom, like Zora Howard has a poem, she's talking about middle school prom, or whether you're talking about an ex like Jasmine Mans has before, like it's the way that you say it, and their honesty inspires me to be that honest in a poem. Because Carvin's Lassant, oh my gosh, he has several poems that I love. Tell Them, I love that poem. But he has a poem called Beauty Part 3. the first time I heard, I think that is, like, Rudy Francisco has an honest poem and it is honest, but I think that the most honest poem that I have ever heard be so self-consciously honest with self and be willing to share that transparency is Beauty Part 3 by Carvin Lasine, where he's really just talking about how he came to understand himself, how he came to realize, or how he came to like behold and recover his self-esteem, the harm that was done to his self-esteem by others, the way that he has learned to behold himself anew as a beautiful person, the harm that he did to others while he was operating in his brokenness. Like, it's just so honest. And you can tell when you're watching it that even though the poem is already written, being transparent and vulnerable like that on stage is still hard for him. And so just the courage when I see poets putting it out there encourages me. I can tell myself the truth on a laptop on a poem that no one's probably ever going to hear. And so those are the poems that really challenge me to come to the table as honestly as I can, be willing to admit something, but also be willing to discover something. So that's me. Okay, Cash and I are gonna share, like Cash said, like you're in for a blessing you didn't know. So Cash and I are gonna share our favorite poems that we have, or a favorite poem that we have written. And you know, we talk about like the process of writing that poem and what it means to us and why it's our favorite or favorite for now or whatever. But yeah, I'm gonna let Cash go first, and then she can say whatever she wants to about the poem and the process and whatever.
Okay, this one is entitled Mental Slavery. My thoughts are but slaves destined to be emancipated from my brain's plantation. Their true desire is to be free of the oppression of rational supremacy, the concept that they are inferior because they do not fit into a box that limits their creativity and expansion. They sing the spirituals to uplift one another while carrying the chains of inferiority as a reminder that one day they will be free at last. They fight a war that only I can see and feel, a war with pride and fear that is not free of casualties. Bought by pride, the master who decides which thought should be sold to the general public, which ones should be house Negroes meant for manipulation and personal enjoyment. Slaves given over to the responsibility of waiting on pride, hand and foot, suckling his children with words that stroke an ego bent on holding back my progress. A master so convinced that the raping of words and implanting of his seeds of destruction are a blessing instead of desecration of art in its purest form. I cannot forget the field Negroes who have the main job of processing what my 9 to 5 requires in order to sustain the quality of life they are used to. Beaten by fear, the overseer that tells my thoughts what is right, when to speak, how to be, and where to go. Fear holds true to his job by overseeing that all creativity is removed through the picking of assignments that create a monotonous routine, allowing for the sun to beam down on the skin of my thoughts and attempt to darken my thoughts. He does so not realizing that the increase of melanin was protecting my thoughts from the cancer of self-doubt. Unknowingly, he reminds my thoughts that their Black is beautiful, powerful, and needed. My thoughts dream of the day that they can taste true freedom by expressing themselves to people everywhere. A day when they're not viewed as inferior to the thoughts of worldly scholars given as scraps meant to be delicacies. A day when segregation between rational and irrational, normal and abnormal no longer exists, and all thoughts are treated as equal. But for now, they work in the fields of anxiety and depression with muscular arm-like paragraphs. They pluck the weeds of discouragement and self-hatred and collect the cotton of edification and charity. There are casualties in this war for mental freedom. There are thoughts beaten to death with whips that try to beat the rebellion and creativity out of them. There are thoughts lynched and hung as a warning sign that radical thinking is not tolerated, a true showcase of pride and fears. But as I mourn those thoughts that did not withstand the abuse, I celebrate those thoughts that turned into words, those sentences that turned into paragraphs, and those paragraphs that turned into poems and short stories. On the epitaphs of the fallen is written, here lies those too precocious for small minds in mental slavery. a tribute to the greatness they possess that did not die with them, but flourishes in their offspring. So that is by far my favorite poem I've ever written. So my favorite author is Frank Peretti, and he has a book called The Oath. And there is like a dragon-like serpent in the book, but the dragon and serpent is a metaphor for sin throughout the whole book. So he stretched this metaphor for this one thing for an entire novel. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna try that with a poem. And I want to try the thing that I know so intimately well, being Black. And I feel like there's so much about slavery that we try to act like wasn't as bad as it was, not we being Black people, but we as in Americans. And so I thought about all the things that happened in slavery. So I thought about the raping and implanting of your seed to cause destruction, to cause strife, to cause dissension within the enslaved people, right? Like I thought about how you put someone over to watch over these enslaved people because your fear is that one day they'll rise up. I thought about all these different things that happen within that we don't talk about in a like countrywide scale. And I was like, I want to put this into something that, one, I know that people can't say they don't understand, because we all know what it's like when people act like the way that we think is flawed. When somebody says that the way that we dreaming is too big, or that what we want or what we desire is just out of our reach. And so I put it with something that we all can understand, with something that we don't like to face the real truth about, so that you can't really not understand, right? Like, so my thought was, and my thought still is you can't read this and not, or hear this and not think about the awfulness that is slavery. But you also can't hear it and not think about the awesomeness that is Blackness, that goes through all of this and still comes out doing any and everything that they can, and traversing and becoming these beautiful, amazing things that you said they were never going to be, right? Like, it, for me, it's just like every time I read it, every time I like say it, like, I don't know, like I just feel blackity black, and I love it. And it just, I don't know. So yeah, but yeah, that's my favorite one. So yeah.
That was a beautiful poem. And here, it was so beautiful, and like listening to it and following, like you said, you can't listen to it because you can listen to it and be like, ooh, anxiety and depression, I understand that. Being called weird or abnormal, I understand that. Neurodivergent, I understand that. And you're like, right, all those things are awful, and they happened, but to people, not to feelings. So like it pulls you in into something. It is sort of the definition of the uncanny, right? Like it is something familiar that just looks a little off, and it pulls you in with the familiarity of the emotional distress, right? That we can all understand, or it's thwarted inspiration. We can understand what that feels like, and forces you to contend with something that you are afraid of, that you are terrified of, that does incite panic or something.
My favorite thing about personification, my favorite thing about that, because like that was what I was going for, is that like you can't act like you don't know, because you know, because these feelings came from us. I just applied them to something that you choose not to think
but
about.
That's what structure does. Like, and that's part of like when I say like structure keeps me honest. Like if you say that you're gonna write a poem that extends a particular metaphor, you're gonna have to be accountable to that metaphor. You're not gonna be able to squirm away from it because something is uncomfortable or something else would be more flattering. You're gonna have to stick to that. And that's a perfect example of the ways that like poetry keeps you honest, when you put a structure in place and you really have to honor that. So yeah, no, beautiful poem. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. You shared that poem, was it a year ago? Maybe a year and a half?
Almost a year. I feel like it was when we did the poetry slam.
Yeah. But there are some poems, and we've said like I can listen to Woman 20 times in a day. I can listen to Love Poem Medley on repeat. Like they're just, yes, like they're just some poems that it doesn't matter how much you hear it, you're gonna find something new. You're gonna appreciate the parts that you already loved. Like it's just good. So you have shared that poem before, but that's a poem that you can really like pick something to focus on every time you hear it and really just like mine that for meaning and and significance and those sort of things.
And
so
now
thank you.
They don't gotta go through a like 2-hour live to find
right. It's right here.
It's right here.
Just bookmark this little moment and you're done. So yeah, I thank you for sharing that amazing poem for sure. For sure. The poem that I'm gonna share is a newer one. My favorite poems fluctuate.
Razzle dazzle.
Razzle dazzle. It is a newer one. It's third wave. So my second wave poems, they are raw. Like there were some of them poems that were just confrontational. And I wanted them to be confrontational and mission accomplished. They were confrontational. They make people uncomfortable, particularly white people. And I was like, great, I'm so glad that I did my job. Like I said, third wave ain't about other people, even if they're pissing me off, it's about me. And so this is not as rah, but it did rah me. Okay. So this is called Under What Circumstances I Have Cried. I cry more at 25 than I did at 18. At 18, only a few improbable fears gaining flesh made me cry. Improbable not because they were impossible, but because I was infrequently home. When they did, I did. Otherwise, I was dry as the old well in that old town where no one lives anymore, and everyone assumes people just moved on instead of died out. That was lower 18 anyway, an old town of benevolent passiveness. Upper 18 cried recklessly and too often, like a child forgotten in an old well of an old town who saw and smelled every death. By 19, my nails were broken and escape forgotten. By 20, the well was normal. 21 didn't even want to escape. Why would you leave home? It's safe here. I live here. 22, remembered God, but was afraid of a long memoried father and old towns with deep wells of shame and anxiety and depression with really good GPS. Do you understand the fear of knowing that bad things know where to find you? Then you understand hunting and haunting and hushed screams, crouched in the cracked closet, looking when you know you shouldn't, when all the scary movie rules say looking will kill you. That was 22 and 23. They knelt in that cramped space together, covering each other's mouths with trembling hands. 24 poked her head out, but always ducked back in. 24 had suspicions that she was jumping at shadows and that all the shadows were her own. 24 asked God for do-overs on tests and felt the retest every single time. 24 was my time to understand how bereft one can be when left in small, dark spaces with all one's mistakes, even if this dark space is different than a deep well in an old town. But God, you are my own God. And at the turn of the quarter century, you brought me jubilee, freedom, light, test passing, glory, and intention. God bless the tears of 25. She knew a little bit. She remembered the smell and sight of her own many deaths and felt the sun shining on her. In spite of it, 25 cried lamentation and eulogy, which is to say that she was ready to leave the funeral and didn't feel bad about it. It's not lost on me that I began this poem at 25 and am now 26, that it took me months to finish beholding all the me's I have been. 26 cries a lot like 25, mixed with a tinge of fear that 24 runs down my cheek sometimes. Sometimes it hurts how much growth is not a straight line, and I know that. And the knowing runs down my cheeks too. I wonder what small spaces and sunlight I have yet to witness and weep over, as I have learned so well to do. So that, like I said in the end of the poem, that poem took me a while to write. And it came from a really simple question of like me just noticing that I was like, when did I start crying this much? I'm crying at commercials. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's such a beautiful family selling ketchup. Like just ridiculous things where I'm like, when did I get so emotional? And so I started writing a poem about it, but as poetry so often does, you ask simple questions and it get deep on you. And so when I fell into this like sort of charting, not crying as much and under what circumstances I would cry, and looking at those things and how they developed and well, why was I crying and what was the emotional environment and what did I fear at that time and how often was I confronted with those fears, it got difficult. I sat back from it. I walked away from it. I forgot about it. I came back to it when I was scrolling through and I was like, oh, I didn't finish this. And I went through and I read it and I was like, oh, okay. So that is definitely one that's like the honesty of it took time. It took time to sit with 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 21-year-old me because they were lost in a particular way. And then to sit with 21 and 22-year-old me, which were hopeless in a particular way. And then 23 and 24 feeling a little hopeful but frustrated. And 25 really feeling like that was a year of jubilee, of really believing that I had been forgiven for things, forgiving myself for things, and saying, God, I think I see where you're telling me I can be now. Right. And so like just sitting with all of the reasons I have cried just weighed a lot. And so it just took longer to sort of mine out any sort of articulation of that. Right. So that is on what occasions I have cried or whatever I titled that poem.
I mean, I'm not saying, it's definitely not lost on me that the year I came into your life is the year of Jubilee, is all I'm saying. All I'm saying. I literally met you like the day before you turned 25. So I'm not saying that, I'm just saying it ain't lost on me that life done changed a lot since we met, is all I'm saying. Amen. Amen. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. No, legitimately, like I was listening and I was like, yo, I feel like every poet has written one of those where they go back and they're writing about a time and reflecting. And I feel like if you haven't as a poet, you probably haven't reflected on yourself enough. Because I'm even thinking about, like, I've done that with my grandmother dying, right? Like the first 6 months, and then I wrote one 8 months later, and then I wrote one a year later, and just the way I felt at those times that I wrote those, and like looking back, like, woo. So when you were reading that, I was like, one, I cannot wait to see what you write when you turn 30. That was the first thought that I had. Because like, like I say all the time, like it's a different thing. And I think about like my 18, 19, 21, 22, and I was just like, yeah, no, those are some crying years. Those are some like figuring out the world years. So I thought it was like a beautiful, beautiful reflection. It felt very honest. And it felt very, very vulnerable, and I felt honored to be able to hear something so personal, because it sounded super personal. Like I had to stop for a minute because I was like, I feel like I'm like encroaching on a very personal moment, like listening to this. I thought it was beautiful, Britt. Like I really did. I thought it was
Thank you.
Like for sure. Like it's a really good poem. I really liked it.
Thank you. But like those are the sort of, that's a third wave poem. So I'm like, yeah, it takes longer. Sometimes I gotta go back. I could write my second wave poems in one sitting, no problem. And there wasn't really much revision that happened afterwards. But I don't even remember what happened. I think something happened where I realized that I wasn't really revising myself and it didn't sit well with me. Second wave poems had their had their use, and I wouldn't, like, they did what they were supposed to do. But as I developed, I was like, do I want to keep being a poet who is only ever talking to other people, even if what I'm saying is necessary? Do I want to really do some introspection? And introspection just so happens to take me a little bit longer, and requires some revision out of, like, is that really true? So yeah, this is definitely sort of the space that I'm in, just checking the straightness of my own path, or the curves of it. But yeah, so that is our poetry process. As y'all can see, though poetry is a shorter medium, it is by no means less thoughtful, less intense. Like, all the emotions that you get from a novel, a short story, flash fiction, you can get those same things in a poem. You can get a story in a poem. I do have an epic that's like almost 10 pages. So like you can get all the things from poetry that you can get from other genres if you so choose. And so, tell us in the comments, if you write poetry, what's your process? How is it different from your prose? How has it grown over time? Who has influenced your writing? All the things. And thank you for sitting with us and our words. I'm sure y'all are all being very kind in the chat, and so thank you. But we're done. We've given our words. They're in the world, and they will do their good work. And until then, we will see y'all later days. Bye bye.